Hello and welcome to Music City Murder, a podcast meant to give people an insight into the history behind Nashville's most infamous murders. The show is hosted by author T. Blake Brady. You can find his novels at Parnassus Books in Green Hills, as well as on Amazon. Fans of James Lee Burke's Dave Robichaux series will probably dig these books too. One last thing before we begin. If you like what you hear, be sure to rate and review Music City Murder on the Apple Podcasts app. It's the little purple icon on your phone. Reviews help to distinguish the show from millions of other podcasts out there. A 5-star review is appreciated, but it doesn't matter what you say. No one is sure how it helps, but it definitely does. It has something to do with the algorithm, I think. Anyway, let's get on to the show.
Welcome. As the intro says, you are listening to Music City Murder. I'm your host, Tyler, and we're just going to dive right into this week's insanity. This is not a Nashville crime. I know. It seems weird, given the fact that this show is called Music City Murder. That said, my obsession with true crime runs deep. And so having this outlet allows me to explore everything true crime related. That's why I've created the Patreon channel. I can tease an episode that will go up on the Patreon, and you can choose to listen or not. The Patreon itself is $1 per month. And for that, you get a bonus episode of the show each and every month, along with the whole backlog of the other episodes. So it doesn't usually have to do with Nashville, but it will always be interesting, and I hope you'll consider joining up. That said, let's move on to this horrifying nightmare of a case. The main source for this is going to be The Night Stalker, a book by Philip Carlo. It's one of the best true crime books I've ever read, to be frank with you, as well as other very sources. So I'm just going to there's a lot that goes into this one. The Night Stalker book will be my main source. And before we jump into the content, I have to be upfront with you right now. This episode won't be an easy episode to listen to for a lot of reasons. The subject, Richard Ramirez, is one of the most detestable serial killers in the annals of true crime. The reason I've chosen this moment to dive in and do Richard Ramirez is the compelling, graphic, and just overall chilling documentary on Netflix. It's called Night Stalker, The Hunt for a Serial Killer. My goal here is to put up a companion to that wonderful documentary, not try to take it on outright. So basically, if you're into the documentary, you'll probably enjoy this episode, maybe episodes of the podcast. There will be details related to his crimes here, and so if you would like to listen, you'll have to check your sense of shock at the door. Richard Ramirez was a monster. Consider yourself warned. And so here we go. My hypothesis for this series of episodes is that monsters are made, not born. And Richard Ramirez's life is proof that they're made through a combination of factors. He was introduced to violence and murder by a family member. Incidentally, you might say. His idol was his older cousin, Miguel Mike Ramirez, a Vietnam combat veteran who had served 2 tours as a Green Beret and came home with 4 medals, along with a pretty nasty case of PTSD. He'd been in a 20-man platoon that got surrounded by Viet Cong, and Mike and one other person were the only survivors of the subsequent battle for survival. Later, according to Richard, Mike bragged of having up to 29 known kills in Vietnam. Richard was 12 when his cousin returned from Vietnam, and he sought out the company of Mike as much as possible. To Richie, and that's what I'm going to call him as he's a young man, Richie. He's not, to me, Richard Ramirez yet. He's a 12-year-old kid. Just think back to when you were 12 years old and what you were like. Just take just dive back into your memory. Just think of one thing that you can remember from when you were 12. So this kid, Richie, was looking up to Mike. And Mike was a bona fide hero in the flesh. Someone who had returned from war with medals and Polaroids and everything else to prove his exploits. Not surprisingly, though, Mike was ill-adjusted for life back home, and for a lot of reasons, he didn't receive proper counseling to get back into being a civilian and to be able to deal with potential PTSD issues that usually arise in post-combat situations. This was true of a lot of Vietnam veterans, actually, and so Mike was not alone in that way. So needless to say, it wasn't a healthy relationship, and Mike exploited his influence over Richie to a disturbing and alarming degree. Not only did he discuss the grisly details of what happened in Vietnam, he also shared photos of his exploits with Richie. This is where the trigger warning comes in. It gets pretty unsettling from here on in. So if you're squeamish in any way, for any reason related to violence against women, or just violence in general, now is the time to step back from the podcast. Come back to a different episode maybe, because it gets pretty grim from here on in. Okay. Those of you who are still with me, let's move ahead. In some of the photos, this isn't just Vietnam. This isn't him working on helicopters or, holding a gun. This isn't just him hanging out with guys who are in his platoon. These are very specific photos to Mike and not indicative of most Vietnam veterans in general. In some of the photos, Mike is holding a presumably loaded .45 against various Vietnam women's heads, Vietnamese women's temples as they perform sex acts on them. So I kind of mangled that, but yeah, he's holding a gun to the heads of women as they are being sodomized, basically. One of the photos depicted Cousin Mike holding a woman's decapitated head. And the terrible part about that, beyond the obvious, is that it was the same woman from an earlier photograph with whom he had engaged in sexual acts. He kept the photos in a shoebox in his closet where Richie had access to them. And access them he did. Purportedly, Richard Ramirez became sexually excited at the gory images. To put a finer point on it, it was here where Satan became a part of young Richie's life. He figured that if he could be excited by such gruesome depictions of death, then maybe Satan would be a better supreme entity for him. It's weird. It's disturbing. I know, but we'll get into that later. Just put that in your back pocket for now and hang on to it. And I just want to remind you, like I said earlier, he was 12 at this time. So, he's not the somewhat innocent person that you or I was, but he's still not lost at this point. And, had someone noticed his sort of predilections and gotten him help, he would not have been completely lost. But that's not the direction that his life takes, as we're going to see. And it should be also noted that when someone you consider an influence behaves in such a careless and downright abusive way, it can distort your sense of right and wrong. His cousin Mike could have been a much better shepherd. This is sort of doesn't mitigate the problem at all, but Mike could have noticed this and had shown some restraint. Because when you're 12, your brain's still forming and you don't quite have a grasp on, what things are, and sort of you can't wrap your head around them. And not everyone, very few people even would be excited by this sort of stuff, but even someone who had recognized it and got him to seek help would have undoubtedly changed Richard Ramirez's life. So I can't say that enough. I mean, I guess I just said it twice in a row, but I just think that's an important point to think about here, is that the role that stewardship can have over a young person's life. And if someone you trust shows you these disturbing images, then on a fundamental level, you might come to think of them as perfectly normal. And that's what happened to Richard, is that he had this connection to his cousin whom he idolized, who would show him these things and then treat it as though it was something that was okay. And even though that 12-year-old Richie had a strained home life, Cousin Mike's influence was long-lasting and horribly misguided. Perhaps more disturbing than the pictures was the collection of shrunken heads that Mike had brought back with him from Vietnam. There were 8 of them, and he kept them in an old suitcase under his bed, telling Ramirez that he had used them as pillows back in Vietnam. Slowly, their relationship became closer, and Mike and Richie would ride up and down Alameda Street in El Paso, smoking weed and listening to the radio, as Mike regaled his cousin with bloody stories from Vietnam, often telling the same stories over and over again. And drugs were nothing new for Richard, who had begun smoking back when he was 10 years old. Members of his family often sparked up in the house, and so Richie saw nothing wrong with it. It made him feel grown in a way, to feel powerful, and that feeling was very important to a young Richard Ramirez, the feeling of power, to have something over someone. And it was then that another incidental event crossed Richard Ramirez's life. A few of his family members got involved in a group called the Brown Berets. It was a group that organized events to protest the treatment of Mexican Americans, which was a hot-button issue in and around Texas cities like El Paso. Because of this political involvement, Cousin Mike took it upon himself to make young Richard his pupil in the ways of war. He took him under his wing and taught him the ins and outs of combat, showing him how to protect himself, how to become invisible, how to kill with stealth, which really has nothing to do with protesting human rights violations, right? But this was Cousin Mike's warped outlook of the world and how he could find a way into it. And if you're wondering where Richie's family was at this point, they were around. You know, they just couldn't do anything to stop. At this point, you know, Richie found someone he liked, and so he attached himself to that person because his home life was so strained. And because he was strong-willed, as many teenagers are, they couldn't get him to leave this guy. This guy was his family, and so it made it a harder argument to, change things. In fact, Richard's dad cursed, yelled, and beat young Richie such that the kid would often flee the house to avoid him, and he'd go sleep in a local cemetery. And just for the record, I'm not trying to make Richard Ramirez a sympathetic figure. But I do think that when you look at the course that his life would take, that there were plenty of sort of places where he could have gone in a different direction. And his father beating him was not a good outcome, but a lot of times people who are either uneducated or poorly educated or under great strain will often use violence where different tactics would be more amenable to someone's growing up. I mean, if the dad had only been able to find a way to talk to Richard about all of this, maybe, I don't know. Things are strained, things are complicated, and I'm sure he had his own things going on too. So it's just odd. As is sleeping in a local cemetery, which is what Richard would do. And Richie's immediate family were not the only ones to notice the disproportionately strange relationship between the muscled-up, tattooed older mentor and his impressionable little cousin. Cousin Mike was married to a Mexican-American woman named Jessie, and together they had 2 children, boys Paul and Arado. Jessie hated Mike's lifestyle. I think we can all sympathize with that. All he did was work out, smoke weed, and ride around with his cousin Richard. She wanted him to get a job to support their burgeoning family, and she often complained to her mother about it, who would often insert herself into their arguments, making the arguments worse. And all of this angst and torment and all of that came to a head on May 4th, 1973. Richie was over at Cousin Mike's, taking shots and playing miniature pool when Jesse came home. She complained that he was spending too much time with his little cousin, that he should get a job and get on with his life. Arguments that I'm sure they had on a pretty consistent basis. Cousin Mike, bristling at the constant barrage of complaints, told her he was tired of her nagging, and when she didn't stop, he walked to the fridge where he was keeping a loaded .38 snub nose. He pointed it at Jessie and told her he'd shoot her if she didn't shut up and quit nagging him about Richie and getting a job. Jessie, undaunted, put her chin out and dared him to shoot her, telling him she didn't think he was going to do it. In one quick motion, he raised the .38 and shot Jessie in the face. The bullet entered her face just above the lip and exited the back of her head. She dropped to the ground, dying instantly, of course, and their two children, who had witnessed the whole thing, began crying. The cramped apartment filled with the smell of spent gunpowder and blood, and young Richie's ears rang with the sound of the gun's violent report. He, too, had seen the whole thing. Cousin Mike told Richie to leave and to never speak about the event ever again. He didn't want Richie to be involved in any way. The teenager stumbled home in shock and sat silently through dinner as the crime was slowly revealed. A family member had called and told them everything, save for the fact that young Richie had been there because no one knew. Mike had already been arrested. He was in jail, being processed for the murder of his wife in front of their two children. And yet Richie had said nothing. It's about this time that I will stop referring to him as Richie. He is now Richard Ramirez. And this moment, the death of his cousin's wife, seems to be the moment that everything changed for him. When everything took on a much darker hue. Later, he would even admit that being near Jessie's dead body made him feel closer to her. Because not just the day of, but a few days after her death, the family went to the house to retrieve some jewelry that Mike had told them about. And Richie went along because, as I said before, his family had no idea that he had witnessed it. Anyway, he stepped inside and saw the blood. And he got an inexplicable tingle, one that he said made him feel in contact with his cousin Jessie. After that, Richard's life changed drastically. He stayed away from school, got high, stole stuff, and got into fights with his dad over all the truancy, all the stealing, and all the drugs. He grew his hair long and smoked pot all day, every day. His dad went so far as to say he could stay home and do nothing, to ostensibly drop out of school, so long as he stopped doing drugs and didn't get in trouble. It didn't work. That summer, Richard left El Paso for the first time and went to Los Angeles to visit his brother, Ruben. Ruben, it should be said, was into some pretty bad stuff himself. Heroin and theft and just general criminal chicanery. It was during his sojourn to L.A. that Richard picked up the habit of breaking and entering on a massive scale. He enjoyed the power afforded to him by being in a stranger's house, of touching their things. It gave him that sense of power that he had always craved. And this was another sort of log to throw on the fire of the raging and furnace that was burning inside of him. And if you add to that the lurid, open sexuality of the city of Los Angeles at this time, you get a powder keg ready to explode in the mind of one Richard Ramirez. The XXX movie houses, the prostitutes sauntering down the street, these things, in the mind of a sane person, will not come to violence. These are common occurrences in most big cities, but in the mind of Richard Ramirez, it was enough to help push him over into something genuinely disturbing and irrevocable. He returned to El Paso and continued to disintegrate. There's a lot here, but I'm going to fast forward beyond his teenage years because I feel like we've gotten enough of a preamble to the carnage that we don't need to litigate every single moment. Just suffice it to say that witnessing the death of his cousin and sort of the sexuality that was mixed up in his whole relationship with his cousin, the violence and the sex that were intertwined with the drugs, and then combine that with his love for breaking and entering, the power of breaking into someone's house, of knowing that you're there and they can't stop you. These things were a sort of heady mixture for him. And so he carried that for a while and continued to get better at it and yet get worse, if you get what I'm saying. So we're going to jump all the way to April 10th, 1984. I also want to say here that it gets even worse than before. So just putting it out there. Okay? If you're like on the edge, just putting this out there. On April 10th, 1984, Mei Lung and her brother were playing in the apartment building where they lived in San Francisco's Tenderloin district. I'm not going to go into how Richard Ramirez came to San Francisco, but he spent a lot of time in San Francisco and kind of bounced back and forth between LA and San Francisco. So just going back in. So Mei Lung was 9 and was playing with her little brother in their apartment building. And she went down to the basement to find a lost dollar bill that she thought that she had, or that they had earlier in the day. When she didn't return, minutes later, her 8-year-old brother went to find her and stumbled upon a horrific scene. And being a parent, this one hits a little hard. And since it deals with a very young child, I'm going to spare you the details. You're welcome on that. And this is not something I want to put in the world. This is kind of where my line is, I think. And so just know that it was awful. Just awful. If you're familiar with the case, you might not have heard about this. You may think that the first murder was was later in 1984. But there's a reason for that. This is Ramirez's first known killing, but it wasn't identified as such until 2009, when Ramirez's DNA was matched to a sample obtained at the crime scene. And I think the situation just goes to underline how often people romanticize serial killers as these sort of like anti-hero rebel figures. And, I think everyone who's dealt with true crime has sort of fallen into this trap. And there's a clear line between being interested in this because of the sort of human elements of it and glorifying it. And I think this moment, the death of Mei Lung, a 9-year-old girl, should remind everybody of who Richard Ramirez really was. He wasn't a, rock and roll rebel carving pentagrams into his hand and screaming "Hail Satan." He was a truly evil, awful monster. And we should remind ourselves of that. Let's move on. The first murder that we often attribute to Richard Ramirez was the death of 79-year-old Jenny Vincal. It was June 28th, 1984, and Ramirez was coming down from a particularly bad cocaine high. It should be noted that this was one of the aggravating factors in Ramirez's killings. Though the cocaine can't be blamed. I mean, people do cocaine all the time without committing these crimes. It certainly exacerbated his mania and psychopathy. He'd get high and drive around, cruising the streets of Los Angeles looking for trouble. And when the high wore off, that's when the anxiety and the anger set in, and the satanic, truly, honestly satanic urges took him over and nudged him toward doing evil's bidding. Here's a direct quote from Philip Carlo's book. Quote, "He was certain that Satan, archenemy of Christ, of all things good, was traveling with him, and that Satan would protect him so long as he stayed evil in his heart and showed no mercy." End quote. It is this man who is driving on the 10 on this night. He got off in an exit on Alhambra. When he couldn't find something bad to get into, he drove over to Glasso Park, a community filled with low-income housing directly north of Los Angeles. What separates Ramirez from a lot of other more organized serial killers is that Ramirez never really planned anything out. He just sort of went with a vibe and followed it to its logical, violent end. And the story is the first example of that. He ended up on Chapman Street next to a cemetery and broke into the apartment of Jenny Vincal, who, like I said earlier, was 79 years old. His original intent was to find something that he might be able to sell for cash or drugs, mostly cocaine, or for sex, because he frequented prostitutes as well. When he found the level of poverty Vincal lived in, he became enraged. And in this rage, he stabbed her with a 6-inch hunting knife. She woke up screaming, but he overpowered her and kept stabbing her, driven by the rush of adrenaline which had prompted his savage outburst. After he finished, he stood in the kitchen of Vincal's house for over an hour, drinking glass after glass of water as he tried to come down from the utter excitement of what he had just done. Jenny Vincal had been stabbed repeatedly while asleep in her bed, and her throat was slashed so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. Ramirez continued to slip deeper and deeper into intravenous cocaine addiction. This was sort of a gradual and then not so gradual decline in his mental and physical health. And to feed this habit, he committed up to 3 burglaries per day, stealing everything from stamp collections to answering machines from people's homes and apartments. During this period, there were no other murders, but there was still a whole lot of crime and his perpetual descent into madness. He truly began to believe demons and Satan were protecting him and watching over him. This would be a theme over the course of the rest of the murders and beyond. When he wasn't getting high and stealing things, he'd hole up in whatever cheap motel he was staying in and watch MTV. The cocaine started to make him paranoid, which caused him to make mistakes, so he gave up the cocaine for a time and moved to pot and alcohol exclusively. Several months passed, and it would be this murder that would catapult him to national notoriety and cement his demented legacy forever. On March 17th, 1985, Ramirez purchased a .22 caliber revolver from a guy who hung out at the bus terminal. He picked the gun because he knew it was deadly, the preferred caliber of hitmen around the world. After that, he stole a car from a gas station and got on the LA freeway with the sole intention of finding his next victim. He was wearing all black, a dark blue AC/DC baseball cap, and carrying a Walkman that was blasting the album Highway to Hell over and over again. On the freeway, he spotted a petite brunette named Maria Hernandez, who was driving her gold Camaro home from dinner at her boyfriend's in Monterey Park. She parked in the garage at the condo she shared with a woman named Dale Okazaki, who was, on the night of March 17th, 2 weeks away from her 35th birthday. She got out and pressed the button that closed the garage door. Ramirez ducked under the garage door, and as a result, his AC/DC hat fell off. He stood back up and aimed the .22 at her head. Maria Hernandez, her back to the murderer, heard the hat hit the ground and turned to face him. He was maybe 20 feet away and coming right for her. From her vantage point, she could see right down the barrel. She screamed something to the effect of, "No, God, please don't," and raised her hand, still holding her keys in defense. Just then, the garage door closed completely, throwing them both into complete darkness. Ramirez fired, and here's the unbelievable, miraculous thing. The keys deflected the bullet. Not letting a miracle go to waste, Hernandez dropped to the ground and played dead. Assuming he'd killed her, Ramirez made his way into the home where he encountered Dale Okazaki in the kitchen of their condo. She ducked behind the kitchen counter, hoping the killer had not seen her. He waited for her to stand back up, and eventually, she did just that, which was when he shot her in the forehead. Okazaki dropped to the ground in a heap. Meanwhile, outside, Maria Hernandez had managed to make it back to her feet. She watched in horror as Ramirez exited the condo. For some reason, perhaps because he thought she was already dead, he walked right past her. He fled through the garage and got into his car, driving off into the night and leaving the first of his eyewitnesses. The horror of this night, though, was that Ramirez wasn't quite done. Within an hour of the murder of Dale Okazaki and the attempted murder of Maria Hernandez, Richard Ramirez chose another target. Veronica Yu, real name Tsai Lian Yu in Mandarin, was a 30-year-old student at the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena. She'd spent the day, which was St. Patrick's Day, with a friend that was heading home to get a good night's rest. Ramirez followed the woman for a few blocks until Yu, noticing that someone was following her, pulled over. Ramirez intended on finding someone else, but then Veronica Yu began to follow him, turning the tables on the killer. He hit a red light on the next block and pulled to a stop. He got out of the car, the gun tucked into his pants, and approached Yu. The two had a brief exchange. Veronica Yu, undaunted by Ramirez, and also skeptical of his story that he thought he knew her, said that she was going to call the police. Ramirez reached through the window and tried to pull her from the car, but he couldn't quite manage it. Instead, he slid across the hood of the vehicle and slid into the passenger side seat. He shot her once in the side and then got out, but not before shooting Yu a second time, this time in the lower back. He got back into his car, got onto and then off of the freeway, and then ditched the car before taking a bus back to downtown LA. After Ramirez had fled the scene, Maria Hernandez scurried into the kitchen and found her roommate lying in a pool of blood. After she called the police, Sheriff Deputies John Powell and Anthony Dallas arrived in a matter of minutes. Down the street, the first officer to arrive on the scene where Veronica Yu had been shot was Rob Endo of the Monterey Police. There he found a weak pulse, but when he asked for a statement, that's when Veronica Yu stopped breathing. The detective who caught the Okazaki Yu killings, in other words, the person who was called up to begin the investigations, was Detective Gil Carrillo, a 6'4", 280-pound wonderkin of a cop. At 34, he was the youngest detective in Sheriff's Homicide, which was comprised of 5 teams of 12 to 16 detectives, including a lieutenant and 5 sergeants. They were responsible for solving all homicides in 64 of the 96 communities that made up the Los Angeles County complex. Carrillo arrived on the scene just after midnight and almost immediately found the blue AC/DC hat. This hat would become one of the defining symbols of the whole Richard Ramirez saga and lead in a roundabout way to his nickname, the Night Stalker. And this is where we're going to end part 1 of Richard Ramirez. Each of the Richard Ramirez episodes will be available on the Patreon. So if you're already a subscriber, you'll get these whenever they come out. If you're not a subscriber, go subscribe. It's $1 a month. You spend less than that on a soda at the store. maybe a pack of gum is more than $1 at this point. Next week, we're going to discuss the bulk of Ramirez's other murders and dive into what made the Night Stalker such an awful, brutal, no-good monster of a man. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Music City